So the last thing I need to talk about with this unit are some common misconceptions when it comes to understanding evolution, the processes of natural selection, and adaptation. We're going to talk about 6 common misconceptions. These misconceptions are 1. Evolutionary change occurs in individuals. 2. Adaptations occur because organisms want or need them. 3. Evolution always results in more complex organisms. 4. Large phenotypic changes require lots of change at the genetic level. 5. Natural selection is a random process. And 6. Evolution perfects organisms. We've mentioned many times before that it's not individuals that change, but it's populations that change. And it's populations that change based on natural selective pressures that causes some individuals to survive and some individuals not to. So if we think back to the finches that we've talked about when we talked about our natural selection case studies, we had existing variation in that population. We had finches with deep beaks and shallow beaks. And the ones that survived the drought, the ones with the deeper beaks, those were the ones that already existed in the population. We didn't have individuals changing their beak depth during their lifetime. So those that were having a hard time finding food during the drought, they didn't change their beak from being shallow to deeper. Those individuals with a shallow beak simply just did not survive, while those with deeper beaks did. And so as a result, they lived and were able to pass on those genes for those deeper beaks to the next generation. And so from generation 1, where we had variation throughout the population, to generation 2, where those with deeper beaks passed on their genes, and so the population overall had deeper beaks, we can see that it was natural selection acting on existing variation that changed what individuals were present in one generation to the next. So once again, individuals cannot change within their lifetime. Only populations changed based what genes are maintained from one generation to the next. Natural selection is not Lamarckian inheritance. So remember that Lamarck was saying, if giraffes are stretching their necks during their lifetimes to reach those leaves, that could be passed on to the next generation. And we simply know that this does not happen. We have traits that are inherited based on their genetic, based on what genes are present. It's not individuals changing within their lifetime and passing those changes that happen during their lifetime on to their offspring. That does not happen. These traits have a genetic basis that gets passed from one generation to the next. And once again, it's just realizing, and Darwin realized this, that natural selection simply sorts what exists in the population already. It doesn't change what's present, it just acts on what's present and causes some individuals to survive and some individuals not to. So once again, if we think about bacterial antibiotic resistance, before selection, you can see that those colored circles, that's the genetic variation present before the antibiotic is applied. After the antibiotic is applied, we see the red circle individuals surviving, and that changes the individuals present in the final population after natural selection has acted. So it's individuals not changing, it's just natural selection keeping some around, and some will live and some will die. And this can be tricky because we do see temporary changes in individuals in response to their environment. So for example, if you go to the mountain, it's going to be really hard to breathe until your body starts producing more red blood cells. These are temporary changes. These are not genetic changes. So you going to Denver, Colorado for the weekend and having a hard time breathing at first and then feeling better after a couple days, that's a temporary physiological change. This is different than populations that have adapted to be at higher elevations, that have actual genetic changes that allow them to to better live at high elevation. So, for example, the native people of Tibet that live in the Himalayan mountains where Mount Everest is, they have a genetic change that allows them to hold more oxygen per red blood cell. This is not a temporary change. This is an adaptation that natural selection has maintained within that population because it helps those individuals survive better at higher elevations. Okay, next, adaptations do not occur because organisms want or need them. So adaptations often result from genetic changes that result in some phenotype that might be advantageous within a certain environment. An organism cannot wish for that mutation to occur to change their phenotype. Mutations are random. Okay, they are a byproduct of mistakes happening during replication. They just happen. If that mutation results in a phenotype that is advantageous within an environment, then good. Then natural selection will keep that mutation around. But most mutations are not advantageous. Most mutations are not going to be beneficial to the organism. So if that individual gets a mutation and within a particular environment they're going to die, they die. Every mutation is an at-chance process, and it just depends on what environment that organism is in, is whether or not that mutation is going to confer an advantage to them. Adaptations do not happen because an organism wants or needs them. It's just by random chance that an organism with an adaptation arises, and then natural selection will either maintain that adaptation if it's beneficial. Okay, so like for example, this beaver here cannot wish that it can have a chainsaw hand because it's a lot easier to cut things down with a chainsaw hand versus gnawing on a tree all day. So just remember that mutations are by chance, adaptations are not going to occur because something wants them. They are a byproduct of chance, and then natural selection will act on them either to maintain them in a particular environment, or if it's not beneficial, a trait will be removed by natural selection. There's another idea that evolution always results in more complex organisms. This sort of goes back to the Lamarckian idea that evolution is constantly improving organisms. Evolution is not progressive. Evolution is a product of natural selection and that organism that organism being better adapted to its environment. So, we can look at the fossil record, and often organisms appearing later in the fossil record seem more morphologically complex, but there is nothing predetermined about this. And in fact, for some organisms, complex traits are routinely lost by natural selection. So an example of this are tapeworms. Tapeworms live in an environment where there's no light. They simply just need to try to absorb as many nutrients as possible to stay alive in order to reproduce. And so they've lost a lot of the complex traits that we see in their other worm relatives. Another example are cavefish. Cavefish have lost eyes, and instead natural selection has favored other traits such as increased taste buds, so that when they find food in the dark, they can taste it. They have a heightened sense of taste to decide if that's something that they want to eat or not. So once again, evolution is basically it's not always making something more complex. Organisms are going to become better adapted to their environments, which can involve the loss of traits over time. This also gets away from there's no such thing as a higher or lower organism. So if we go back to, thinking about the great chain of being, humans were considered the best and the highest organisms, and that's not what happens. Evolution is a branching process. There's no higher or lower organism. Each organism is well adapted to its particular environment. So a lot of people think that humans are the highest type of organism that there is, and this is simply not the case. Compared to chimpanzees, we were just living with different selective pressures. And so, each group of great apes is um, well adapted to the environment that it's living in. Another big misconception is that you have to have like these huge changes in protein coding regions in order to get these really big mutation effects, these really off phenotypes. And we know that this is not the case. So we've talked about that a single base change, a single point mutation, can have a larger phenotypic effect. So think back to the hemoglobin. It's only one base that's changed that drastically changes how the red blood cell looks. We've talked about changes in promoters and switches. So you can have the protein coding region remains intact, but it's the switch that's broken. And so that's how we get the pelvic spines versus no pelvic spines in some populations of stickleback. And we talked about the promoter example with being lactose intolerant. So a change in the promoter can either affect your ability to digest milk or not digest milk. You don't have to break the actual gene to get some sort of big change in the phenotype. Another misconception is that natural selection is random. Natural selection is not random. Mutations that create new gene versions, new alleles, those are random. Those are random mistakes that happen during replication. Natural selection is not random. It's either going to keep that mutant allele in the population or not. Okay? So, if that mutant allele causes a phenotype that is advantageous within that environment, it will be maintained. If it is not, you would expect it to be removed from the population. And so you can see that here. So you can see that, a mutation can create variation. You're going to have some mutants, though this white circle mutant is not favorable, so it's going to be selected against, while you have these other mutants who are able to go on, and at some point, some of these lighter mutants here, those become unfavorable given the environment, and so the favorable mutations are more likely to survive overall. So once again, mutations are random. Natural selection either maintains or removes that mutation. It's not a random process. It either keeps it or it doesn't. Another idea is that evolution perfects organisms. And lots of organisms possess traits that are not adapted but exist because they were present in some sort of ancestral population. So you have little tailbones that are located off of your pelvis. This isn't because they provide some sort of advantage to you. That's a vestigial trait that exists as a byproduct of your evolutionary past. Goosebumps. That's a trait that's a byproduct of your evolutionary past. Us having little raised bumps when we're cold, that's not making us a more perfect organism. They're just byproducts of our evolutionary history. Okay, so these are just vestigial traits that are remaining in present day populations. Some adult traits exist as holdovers. So, for example, nipples on males. So all babies start as female and will only develop into a male once testosterone kicks in around day 60 of fetal development. Male nipples have no evolutionary purpose. It's just a byproduct of our early development. So not every trait that we have has a purpose. They're just sort of leftovers from either our evolutionary past or just byproducts of how our developmental processes work. Silent mutations. So, silent mutations aren't perfecting any sort of organism. They don't change the phenotype because they don't change the amino acid. And so these are mutations that can't be acted on by natural selection. So they're not adaptive in any way. So if evolution was perfecting organisms, you would expect every mutation to result in some sort of phenotype that's going to make an organism better and better. And that's simply not the case when we look at silent mutations in the DNA. They're not changing the phenotype at all and are not going to be acted on by natural selection at all. But sometimes a single allele can affect multiple traits, what's known as genetic correlation. So, in the finches, we talked about the individual with deep beaks survive better than those with the shallow beaks when there was the drought and we only had those really hard seeds for the finches to eat. While it's optimal to have a very deep beak, um, uh, having a deep, narrow beak would be very beneficial, but you can't do that because beak depth is correlated with beak width. And so, trying to optimize one trait can't always happen because you have these constraints in the ability to develop two different uh, areas of that trait at once. And so, a single allele can affect multiple traits. And so if you change, one trait, you can also change the other. And so you can't ever optimize both. Sometimes you have a lack of genetic variation and that constrains adaptation. So a perfect example of this is regeneration. So, it'd be really great if we could all regenerate lost body parts, right? So if you cut off a finger, it'd be really great if you could regenerate your finger the way that, when a lizard loses its tail, the lizard can regenerate its tail, but we don't have that genetic capability. We do not have the genes that control that regeneration. And so some organisms have a lack of genetic variation that does not allow it to adapt to an environment in a particular manner. Fitness can be a trade-off between traits, can be a compromise. So if we think back to those finches during the drought in the Galapagos, finches with large bodies could chase away smaller birds so they could eat food. But the bigger you are, the more food you need to be able to maintain life. So, it actually made them more prone to starvation because they had a higher food requirement that they couldn't meet due to lack of food in the environment. So, even though large size could be advantageous in an environment where there's a lot of food prevalent, in an environment where there's drought and food is not readily available, it actually counteracts that trait under certain conditions. So, being large is good if you can chase other people away, but if you need more food to eat and there's not food, well, that's not good. So a lot of times, fitness can be a trade-off and a compromise between different traits that an organism possesses. So because selection acts on many traits at once, every adaptation can be considered a compromise. So if we look at the peacock, for example, sexual selection causes males to be brightly colored and have these large, elaborate tails, which is good in trying to increase fitness for trying to find a mate, but it's bad if that male encounters a predator. So it's a compromise in order to try to pass genes on to the next generation. And finally, adaptations can be constrained by evolutionary history. All traits that you have evolved from previously existing traits. So, for example, our ear bones have actually evolved from jawbone components from our reptilian ancestors. And so, we could probably have really awesome hearing, but our hearing is limited by the ability of the bones that we have to evolve in such a manner to allow for hearing. And so, the traits that you have are constrained by, what was present to be acted on by natural selection in our previous ancestors. Okay, so make sure that if there's any questions about this, you let Dr. O'Quinn know. Remember to email me if you have any questions or stop by office hours. You are going to have to know these misconceptions for the exam, and you'll have some questions about these misconceptions in the homework that's due the Tuesday night before the exam.